Bonsoir, welcome. Welcome to this very special event for Jews from Arab countries and Iran. Bienvenue à cet événement très spécial sur les Juifs des pays arabes et d'Iran. My name is Philippe Hazan, president of Or Shalom, here in DDO, Quebec, Dollard-Des-Ormeaux, Quebec. We are proud to be partners of B'nai Brith Canada on this very special event. This annual commemoration is an important acknowledgement of the tremendous history and hardships that many of our Sephardic and Mizrahi members of our Jewish community have endured over time. It is fitting that this commemoration be held in a congregation such as Or Shalom. We celebrate the influence, the rich culture of our members, and have shared with us daily. Ce soir, nous rendons hommage à nos confrères séfarades et mizrahi qui ont subi injustice, atrocités et qui ont été expulsés des pays arabes qu'ils habitaient depuis plus de 2500 ans, et simplement parce qu'ils étaient juifs. Or Shalom est imprégné depuis sa création de cette riche culture et célébrons aujourd'hui cet événement dont nous jouissons à chaque jour. Let's begin our program with B'nai Brith Canada CEO Michael Mostyn, who will say a few words. Then we'll watch a quick historical video of Jews from Arab countries and Iran.
Good evening. I'm Michael Mostyn, Chief Executive Officer of B'nai Brith Canada. Today, along with Jewish communities around the diaspora and in Israel, we commemorate the expulsion of Jews from Arab countries in Iran. The first expulsion of Jews from Arab countries in Iran began in the late 1940s and continued into the 1950s. In the process, 850,000 Jews were forcefully expelled from their homes, communities, and nations. Many left behind all material possessions and escaped only with their lives. These Jews, many who spoke only Arabic or Farsi, were forced to start anew either in the diaspora or in Israel, where they made significant contributions to their societies. Despite their resilience and bravery, and no matter their efforts to maintain their traditions, the expulsions of Jews led to the end of a 2,500-year-long history in Arab countries and Iran. Today, from Lebanon to Libya, Jewish communities remain very small and nearly non-existent. Yet, these regimes that so brutally turned on their Jewish citizens failed to grasp the impossibility of ever completely erasing the Jewish histories of those countries. Indeed, the Jews from Arab countries and Iran remain alive in the history of the countries that expelled them. Today, a traveler to Beirut or Baghdad may be hard-pressed to find a Jew. But if one takes the time to look closely at the art and architecture of these cities, takes the time to study the history of these magnificent regions, the Jewish contributions are identifiable and impossible to deny. This essence lives on in their descendants around the world, including here in Montreal and in Israel, where the traditions of these communities remain alive. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Today is an annual day of commemoration to remember the overlooked and forgotten history of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries and Iran who were displaced from their ancient communities they've lived in for over 2,500 years. Approximately 850,000 Jews from Arab countries and Iran were forced to migrate in a mass exodus around 1948 and beyond, during the time that the State of Israel declared its independence and in the years following. The first few massive waves of migration took place in the late 1940s and early 1950s, primarily from Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. Almost all of these entire Jewish communities were forced to leave their respective countries with almost none of their belongings. Their properties, such as homes, were seized by the government, and many could only take with them articles of clothing and family heirlooms. Later waves of migration peaked during the 1956 Suez Crisis in Egypt, and many other countries followed suit in attempting to forcibly remove their Jewish populations. In total, around 70% of these Jewish communities immigrated to the newly founded State of Israel, and the remaining 30% settled in France and the United States of America. Today, Only a very small number of Jews remain in the Arab world and Iran, paling in comparison to what these communities once looked like. Since the fall of the Second Temple period and displacement of the Jewish population outside of Israel, many Jews had settled in other areas of the Middle East and North Africa. While some traveled further to Europe and beyond, a large number of Jewish communities continued to live in the Middle East where they thrived, creating unique dishes, music, art, and many other traditions still observed to this day. Each of these Jewish communities have a very rich and unique identity, which developed over time alongside other groups in the countries they lived in. Although life wasn't always perfect, throughout the Middle Ages, many more Jews from the Iberian Peninsula sought refuge in Muslim lands such as Morocco during the time of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, where Jewish and Muslim communities were forced to either convert to Catholicism or be killed or expelled. In the 19th century, during the scramble for Africa and the further colonization of the Middle East by the European powers, many of these nations had begun to become more increasingly unstable. The Jewish communities had always been a minority, but they then found themselves at a crossroad between themselves, other native peoples, and the European colonists. In 1948, the Arab-Israeli War broke out, ending in a victory for Israel. This, however, caused riots and pogroms all across the Middle East targeted primarily at the Jewish communities. Entire towns were razed, and the Jewish people were forced to flee. Some countries allowed Jewish emigration out of the country, such as Iraq in 1950, that allowed Jews to leave on the condition that they relinquish their Iraqi citizenship. Many nations did not allow Jewish emigration at first, but quickly followed suit in letting them leave after pressures from world leaders. Subsequently, Israel successfully completed many missions, airlifting thousands of Jews out of Yemen, Morocco, and Iraq. The last of the mass exodus events to occur was that of Iran following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, though many Jews had decided to migrate prior. In 1948, there were approximately 150,000 Jews living in Iran. Around one-third of those Jews left Iran for Israel. In 1979, following the revolution, almost all the remaining Jews left. Only around 20,000 remained, and today that number has dwindled down to around 8,500 people. This period of migrations marked a sad time for the ancient communities of Jews that had called these nations their home for better or for worse. Although they faced many hardships, a new chapter in their lives were just beginning as they immigrated primarily to Israel, the USA, France, and Canada. They obtained more rights, enjoyed religious freedoms, as well as a secured safety from the state. Unfortunately, there has not been any justice or restitution for the refugees and their descendants. An estimate between $100 billion to $300 billion of property value was lost amongst the combined wealth of the Jewish communities of the Middle East and North Africa. Today, we pay tribute to these Jewish communities.
Hi, I'm Marty Morantz, Member of Parliament for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley in Winnipeg. Canada is blessed to be home to such a vibrant and engaged Jewish community that has enriched our society. As well, the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews have a rich heritage and culture all their own and their own unique history. They and their descendants make up nearly half the population of Israel, and they comprise a significant part of the Jewish population in Montreal, throughout Quebec, and in fact in communities all across Canada. After the birth of the State of Israel, more than 900,000 Jews immigrated there from Arab lands, most under incredible duress, having to leave everything behind. They left the countries of their origins a legacy, and they have also enormously aided the growth and prosperity of Israel, while also putting down strong roots in adopted countries such as Canada. It is our duty to share their history, too often unknown to the general public, and in fact too often unknown to their fellow Jews. Tonight, B'nai Brith is celebrating their history and resilience. I want to thank B'nai Brith for this event, and on behalf of Canada's Conservatives, and from my family to yours, may this holiday season bring everyone peace, joy, and goodwill.
Thank you. So we just heard from Marty Morantz, Member of Parliament from Charleswood St. James in Manitoba. Next, we will hear from Rachel Bendayan, Member of Parliament for Outremont, Quebec, and the only member of the House of Commons of Sephardic heritage. So let's meet the first of our two powerful testimonials, Nina Rabi. Nina Rabi is a native of Lebanon and a member of Or Shalom. Nina, please join us. Nous allons rencontrer maintenant notre premier des deux très puissants témoignages que nous allons avoir ce soir. Nina Rabi est une membre de Or Shalom et originaire du Liban. Merci Nina de vous joindre à nous.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and with all this introduction as well. I feel really very confident to do it right now. Well, like he just mentioned, Philip, that my name is Nina Rabi, as you already know. I am a Lebanese Jew, a descendant of Syrian parents. Our family lived well and prospered in the Middle East for the so many generations before me that I cannot even relate to that. It is a great privilege for me to be able to describe to you a little bit about my Jewish life in Lebanon as I remember it. Life was good for us when I was a child. We had a Jewish community that was well organized and had a good understanding with the Christian government in power at the time. For example, during the Jewish high holiday, our community used to welcome all government representatives, priest and imam included, within our synagogue. This happened much like we have today when our government representatives address our community. Following the independence of State of Israel in 1948 event, started to turn this official that once visited our community synagogue had stopped. And our community began feeling the tension in the atmosphere between the Jews and the politicians around us. The influence of the Arabs disconnect with the State of Israel had begun having its effect. A memory that is really very strong embedded in my mind that symbolized our changing reality when the bombing of our school, the Alliance Israélite, the bomb, which had apparently been scheduled to go after 8 a.m., while all the children were in school, had, thanks God, gone off earlier at around 7 a.m. The janitor of the school and our principal, Madame Bensoussan, had become the victim. Imagine the bomb having gone off as scheduled. Imagine all the children in already school. I would not be standing here today if that had not happened in that way. A little after that time, we began hearing story of kidnapping community member. But no one was able to prove anything or prevent anything, as these were random attacks against us, the Jews, from time to time. We also heard story of bombing of Jewish homes. These bombings were completely instigated and had injured and killed some of our community members. Fast forward to the 1967 war, the situation got even more intense. Many of our community members began thinking to leave Lebanon to offer their children a more secure future. We were one of those. In a few months, we ourselves would be leaving and coming to Canada, and I am so glad we did. I remember being a young mom at home two men, strangers, came knocking at my door looking for my husband. I naively answered them that he was at work, and then they left. My neighbors, who saw the man, warned me to be aware that men were attached to some secret service. That night, when my husband returned home, I asked him, who were these men? As I was pregnant, he did not want to worry me. A few weeks later, my husband told me we have to leave the country and we have to apply to the Canadian embassy as soon as possible, as we need to leave this place and fast. For better or worse, we landed in Canada in 1968. If you allow me one more story, let me backtrack a bit to give you more context beyond the Lebanese situation. When I was a child, we used to visit my maternal grandparents at their summer home in Damascus, Syria. My grandfather used to take my brother and I to synagogue every Shabbat and insisted to always have joined him in for the Amidah so that he can give us the Kohen blessing. On one of those Shabbat, while we had just finished getting the blessing, we heard a big blast and immediately saw thick black smoke coming from the front hall of the entrance of the synagogue, which was full of kids that were playing there. Unfortunately, the bomb hurt and killed our young friends. I remember it very vividly, and we ran away from the scene. Following that incident, my grandparents moved from Syria to Lebanon, thinking it would be more secure and safer for them as a Jews. But safer it was not. These Jews from Damascus did not take any identification with them. They merely left the house with a small valise in hand, leaving behind homes, property, businesses, among others. They simply locked the door and walked away just like that. Life for them, as they knew it had ended, and a new one would have to be built. Lives were saved by buying false identity paper that helped them people create new identities and allow them to immigrate to other countries such as Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, New York, and some here to Canada. In 1973, we had not been convinced they had, In 1973, those who had not been convinced that they had to leave yet experienced the worst of the situation. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope I was able to give you some good insight into our history of the Jew from the Arab lands. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will hear from Rachel Bendayan from Outremont, Quebec.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Rachel Bendayan, députée fédérale d'Outremont. I imagine many people in the room know who I am, but just in case, my name is Rachel Bendayan, and I was recently re-elected as the Member of Parliament for Outremont. I'm so grateful to be able to address everyone here this evening, and I apologize that I can't be with you in person. As you can imagine, the parliamentary session has restarted and we are busy in Ottawa doing the work of the country, and I do hope to be able to join you in person very soon. But all of my thanks go to B'nai Brith for organizing this important evening, and particularly to CEO Michael Mostyn for putting this important event together and bringing such esteemed guests to the table. I would also like to thank everybody who works with B'nai Brith Canada, especially for the work that you do to fight against anti-Semitism and hatred in all of its forms. As you have probably heard me say, I cite B'nai Brith statistics fairly often, both in the House of Commons and outside, particularly the numbers in relation to incidents of hate. And those numbers are only going up. It's actually something that I experienced very personally in this most recent campaign, where my election posters, many of them were defaced with swastikas. But I am very eager to speak on the theme of this evening and of this important event. For those that may not be aware, I'm the only Sephardic member of Parliament currently sitting in the House of Commons, and I am actually the first Sephardic woman ever to be elected to Canada's legislature. I'm extremely proud of that fact. Étant la seule députée fédérale séfarade en fonction en ce moment, et seulement la deuxième personne séfarade à être élue au Parlement, je ressens une responsabilité énorme. Et je sais aussi que je marche dans des pas de géant. Je suis tellement inspirée par le parcours de notre premier élu séfarade de l'histoire du Parlement canadien, l'honorable Jacques Sada, maintenant à la retraite. Et Jacques est un ami, un mentor et un leader incroyable au sein de notre communauté. Mes parents sont tous deux nés à Tanger au Maroc, à une époque où environ 300 000 Juifs vivaient dans le pays, ce qui représentait à l'époque à peu près 2,5% de la population. En 1964, ce nombre était tombé à seulement 5 000. C'est incroyable quand on y pense. Aujourd'hui, il y a à peu près 2500 Juifs au Maroc. La plupart de ces immigrants ont choisi de s'installer soit en France, soit en Israël. Mes parents ont choisi le Canada. J'ai grandi à Montréal en entendant des histoires sur ce à quoi ressemblait la vie juive au Maroc et sur la riche histoire qui est encore visible dans la société marocaine à ce jour. My mother was actually only 1 year old when she left Morocco to come settle here in Canada. My father was in his early teenage years when he arrived, and his family settled in Côte-des-Neiges in the riding that I now represent. In addition to hearing from my grandparents about life in Morocco for Jewish families, I also heard a lot about the difficulties around their departure, what it was like for a family to flee their country in search of a new world, a new life. Alors, évidemment, j'ai grandi en entendant les histoires de bateaux qui partaient chaque jour remplis à ras-bord de personnes cherchant à quitter le pays en emportant tous les objets de valeur qu'ils pouvaient cacher avec eux. C'est la même histoire que celle vécue par tant de familles juives d'Afrique du Nord, du Moyen-Orient et de l'Iran dans les années 50, 60 et 70. It is so important to remember this part of our history. A time where 850,000 people, many fearing for their safety and that of their families, had to flee their countries of birth. We cannot forget this exodus. There are so many signs of the former Jewish presence in Morocco today, from the Beth El Synagogue in Casablanca to the countless Jewish cemeteries across the country. And this history can and should, I think, serve as a basis to move forward, to bring people together, to forge closer ties between Jewish and Muslim families everywhere. And these are hopeful times. They really are. The Abraham Accords are an important step forward, and just a few short days ago, the first ever direct agreement between Israel and Morocco was signed. I look forward to working on strengthening these ties, and I look forward to being a voice for peace and vivre ensemble, both here in Canada and around the world. Merci et au plaisir de se revoir très bientôt.
It is my pleasure to now present David Bensoussan, a Moroccan Canadian and a historian on Jews from Arab countries and Iran. He is a published author and a PhD in electrical engineering from McGill University. J'ai le plaisir d'accueillir notre prochain invité, un juif marocain, historien sur la matière, un auteur publié et docteur en génie électrique diplômé de l'Université de McGill, David Bensoussan.
Merci. Cela fait toujours plaisir d'être ici. J'ai vu cette synagogue à ses premiers débuts. Et s'il vous plaît, l'écran ici n'est pas allumé. Bien. Nous sommes prêts à commencer. Alors le sujet ce soir, vous savez qu'il y a beaucoup de façons d'étudier l'aspect des Juifs des pays arabes et les sorties. Le sujet, c'est les conditions dans lesquelles ils sont sortis. Tonight, we're not going to discuss legalities. We're not going to discuss positions of governments. We're going to discuss only the conditions in which Jews from the Arab world in Iran left. And I'm going to try to give you photographies of the epoch. And through these photographies, we'll understand and study more. Okay, as you can see from this slide, you see the number of Jews who have left the Arab lands and Iran, talking about more than 850,000 people. The biggest chunk of Jews, population, Jewish population was from Morocco, 260,000 and more, and followed by Iraq and then Egypt and so on, Iran, and today there's almost nobody in those countries. Morocco keeps still 2,500 Jews. Okay. All right. As you can see, from every country, Jews were settled for a long, long time. We're talking not centuries, but millenniums. Jews for instance, in Morocco, or were there from the first millennium. Same in Egypt, since the time of Jeremiah, that means 6th century BC. In Libya, they were there since the 3rd century, the Greek times, and so on. So it's a very, very old Jewish community. In Iraq, in Babylon, where the Talmud was written, it was around the 6th century BC that Jews were settled there. The conditions in which Jews departed varied from country to country. As you can see, there were some violence, there were also some dispossession, there was also denaturalization, there were also obstacles, obstructions to departures, and so on, but it varied from one country to the other. The hardest conditions were for Jews of Iraq and Egypt and Libya. In the rest, it was not easy, but we'll see that nevertheless, it was not a picnic. Déjà en 1948, le New York Times disait « Il y a un gros danger pour les Juifs du Moyen-Orient, étant donné que l'on s'attend à ce que dans les pays arabes, leurs conditions s'aggravent très très sérieusement. » Difficulties were everywhere. In Morocco, there were some massacres in 1948, in northeast of Morocco, also in 1954, In Tunisia, the synagogue was ransacked in 1967. In Iraq, there was a pogrom, a very serious pogrom, on which we'll speak more about. In Libya, there were pogroms in 45 and 48. In Yemen, Jews left under difficult conditions. And Syrian Jews also were subject to violence, rampage, and so on. Trying to get the clicker to work. Voilà. Bien. One thing which is not known is the fact that the Arab League in its time, which has most of the countries of the Middle East, had an edict decided to, by law, to dispossess all the Jews. All the Jews were considered to be belonging to the Jewish minority of Palestine, and that was much before Israel was created. All their possessions, their bank accounts had to be frozen. This has been decided by the Arab League. It's not known, but nevertheless it's very important because we're talking about 1947, much before the Israeli-Arab War. Okay. Next slide, please. Alors, ce n'est pas su, mais en 1947, c'est-à-dire bien avant la guerre israélo-arabe, la Ligue arabe de l'époque avait décidé, par édit, de dénaturaliser tous les Juifs et de les déposséder de toutes leurs possessions, et tous ceux qui auraient des sympathies sionistes, etc., seraient incarcérés. Et c'est ce qui, en fin de compte, avait été décidé. Et cela, c'est bien avant qu'il y ait eu un seul réfugié au Moyen-Orient. Donc la décision était déjà là. En Irak, la communauté est très ancienne, on a dit que c'était du VIe siècle. Il y avait la communauté citadine de Bagdad. Bagdad était une ville avec une très importante population juive. Et naturellement, dans les montagnes du Kurdistan, il y avait également les Kurdes. En 1941, il y eut un régime pro-nazi et un pogrom qu'on appelait le Farhoud, dans lequel 179 personnes périrent, mais il y eut naturellement des centaines et des centaines de blessés, des incendies, et cela n'a jamais été plus le même. Par la suite, en Irak, il y a eu des pendaisons, des boycotts économiques, il y a eu dénaturalisation et dépossession. Tout cela s'est produit successivement dans les années 49, 50 et 51. So Jews of Iraq had to leave due to all the persecutions, and what you can see, they went to the land of milk and honey, but no water. You see them coming to the Holy Land. Then we have Jews of Syria. Jews of Syria were a very, very established community, also very old. But again, you had some violence in 47, and Jews were not allowed to have a telephone, were not allowed to buy property, were not allowed to basically do anything, and they were under constant surveillance. And it took a long, long time to take them clandestinely from Syria, and basically today there's almost nobody there. Lebanon, as you can see here, very, very peaceful, very nice country. Jews were forbidden to belong to the public service. I mean, they simply could not work for government. And as we had witnessed from the previous person, it was more difficult for Jews with time. Egypt. En Égypte, la communauté était très ancienne. On parle déjà du VIe siècle avant l'ère courante. Et au XXe siècle, la première moitié du XXe siècle, la communauté juive était très florissante. Jews of Cairo, Alexandria were flourishing, very, very happy, and then things started to happen. Number one, in 1948 there was Israeli war, and between 50 and 56, systematically the government started to change the laws to take out the Egyptian nationality from the Jews one by one, until finally, in 1956, Jews were simply expelled from Egypt, and their passport had simply one notion, had a mark, simply a departure without return. This is a picture of the famous Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, which had its golden times. This is a Jewish store, the biggest in Cairo, which was simply put to fire in 1952. And as I told you, the testimony showed that passports were simply saying no ability to return to Egypt. Next, we have Aden. Aden, that means New Yemen. There was also riots in 47. Jews of Yemen started to escape from Yemen. Some of them crossed the Arabian desert by foot. Most of them came by plane in Operation Magic Carpet to Israel in 48. Obviously, Israel was not ready for such an influx, but nevertheless managed with it. And then Libya also a very old Jewish community. You can see here a Jewish school, and pogroms in Libya. They were fired in 45, in 48, and after Gaddafi came to power, Jews simply left completely Libya. As you can see here in this picture, in Tunisia, you had a very traditional Jewish community, and in Tunisia, there's an island called the Jerba Island. C'est une île dans laquelle la tradition veut que les deux portes du temple, les portes de Nicanor, se trouveraient en dessous de cette synagogue. Mais chaque année, il y a des pèlerinages, encore aujourd'hui, qui participent à cette fête annuelle à Jerba. Algeria, Jews of Algeria became French in 1868. As you can see here, they fought in the First World War to side the French army. And during Second World War, you had the Pétain, the Vichy regimes, the Nazi measures, which were harsher somehow in Algeria than in France. And simply Jews of Morocco and Tunisia were in line. We know that from the documents we have discovered today. Then we have, after that, we come to Morocco. Morocco is the most important Jewish community of Arab lands. In 1948, after the massacres in Zelija, 25,000 Jews left. Immediately after that, Morocco fought for its independence in 1950, which it got in 1956, but many Jews were afraid not to have any protection and started to flee. 90,000 Jews left between 1948 and 56. Then something happened. After 56, Jews went to Israel, but it was clandestine, nobody should know. And you can see in the next picture, Nasser visited, President Nasser from Egypt, visited Morocco. I was standing 5 meters from him in this picture. And when he came with policemen, and they take any kid with a kippah directly to prison, including a rabbi, which happened to be a Swiss rabbi. So they simply took off his teeth and shaved his beard. And the Syrian and Egyptian policemen wanted to show the Moroccan police how to act with Jews, basically. So the big panic, and at the same time, you had Morocco belonged to the Arab League, as you can see. So many Arab League measures like boycott of Israel, any newspaper, any book speaking positive of Israel was forbidden. And you had naturally the shipwreck, the Peace Spices. It's a boat full of immigrants that sank in the Mediterranean. Ceci est le naufrage du Pieces en 1961, peu après la visite de Nasser. Et c'est à ce moment-là que la grande majorité des Juifs du Maroc sont partis sciemment. Mais c'est aussi à ce moment-là que le roi Hassan II a dit la chose suivante: je comprends que les Juifs regardent dans la direction de Jérusalem comme moi je regarde la Mecque. Il a laissé les Juifs partir. On voit ici par exemple les Juifs de l'Atlas qui partent. Donc c'était semi-officiel, ce n'était pas officiel, il fallait y aller en cachette. Et naturellement, si on vendait ses propriétés, on faisait ça à la va-vite, sans dire où on allait. Et vous voyez ici les conditions d'arrivée des Juifs, par exemple ici, à Haïfa. Le bateau, c'est moins dramatique que ce que l'on a connu en Irak et ailleurs, mais néanmoins, c'était clandestin et c'est ainsi que la communauté juive marocaine s'est vidée directement. En Israël, durant toutes ces années, all those years, you had Ma'abarot, that means transit camps. Ma'abar is transit. And in these transit camps, you had hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab lands, which simply came with the Jewish refugees from Europe. And the country had to deal with this with the help of the Yishuv, that means of the people Israeli which were there, and with the help of the diaspora. And today, the reality has changed completely. If you go today to the developing town, you'll see thriving Jewish community there in those places. Voilà donc, alors c'était pour vous dire simplement que le traitement des Juifs n'a pas été partout le même. Il y a eu de la violence partout. Dans le cas du Maroc, les autorités ont dit simplement violemment critiqué, intensément critiqué toute cette violence. Et puis ailleurs, les décrets étaient là. Et finalement, si quelqu'un veut un peu plus d'informations, il y a un livre de David Bensoussan qui est un livre professionnel, c'est d'un professeur d'université qui est absolument extraordinaire avec tous les détails techniques du départ. Il y a le livre de Lynn Julius, an excellent book, very factual, on the Jews of Arab lands, and my own book, Il était une fois le Maroc, which speaks specifically about Jews of Morocco. Et voilà, pour finir, j'ajouterai la chose suivante, c'est que au Canada, nous avons fait des interventions au Parlement canadien et suite à cette intervention, le Canada a simplement mis sur la table simplement que s'il n'y a jamais des négociations pour les réfugiés, cela se fera en tenant compte également des réfugiés juifs pays arabes et pas seulement des autres. Alors voici la résolution qui a été votée et acceptée. Bon, on y arrive. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, M. Bensoussan. Our second testimonial comes from Gladys Muallem, a published author and a native of Iraq. Notre second témoignage nous est offert par Gladys Muallem, une auteure d'origine irakienne. Le témoignage va être lu par Lisette Chouchoua. Merci, Lisette.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lisette Chouchoua. I am happy to read Gladys Muallem's testimony. She couldn't make it, so I am reading her testimony for her. She condensed this testimony from 2 previous articles published in CJC website, CJN, and Aleinu magazines. The year was 1951. We were living in Baghdad. I had just finished my matriculation exams, but the dreams I had and those of my family were shattered by a new political climate. The Iraqi government was accusing Jews at random of being either Zionists or communists and imprisoning them, torturing some with the most horrible means, and hanging them in public. This was all done in front of their families and was used to spread fear and terror throughout the 185 members of the Jewish community in Iraq. Life was not normal anymore. We were all scared, worried, confused. We all found that people we knew were disappearing. Prominent Jews, influential people in our society. No one knew to whom we could turn. Nobody felt safe, especially since neither the Iraqi government nor the British Authority did anything to protect the Jewish citizens. The Baghdad Jewish community was an ancient one. It had started 200 and 700 years ago with the destruction of the first temple when Jews were taken captive to Babylon. The community quickly established itself and built famous yeshivot that produced the Babylonian Talmud between 500 and 700 CE. The major among them was located in Nahardaya and Mehuza. In my time, the Jewish community had several schools for both boys and girls, like the prestigious Alliance Israélite, where I studied. Together with my friends and younger sisters, we also had Jewish sports and social clubs. While most Jewish communities in Europe and in much of the Arab world were suffering from the hands of different regimes, our history was generally comfortable. For centuries, we were left alone to have our own schools and neighborhoods. We ran our own businesses. We were very proud of what we have done and our place in society. But suddenly there was panic. We were mistreated, terrorized, and not wanted in our own country. It seemed unthinkable, yet we were beginning to realize that we had to leave the land of our birth and our ancestors. German propaganda of World War II led to the Farhud in 1941, and more attacks as well. Mistreatment, murder, looting, torture made life unbearable for Jews. Now, after the creation of Israel in 1949, life became impossible. Everybody needed desperately to find a way out. Some people tried to escape, others did not dare. Where to go and how? Very few Jews were allowed to obtain a passport, and even if they did, other countries accepted very few. At last, through international pressure, the Iraqi authorities allowed Jews to leave. However, they had to renounce their Iraqi nationality. Once most of them applied to leave the country, a new law appeared to unfortunately freeze all properties and all the money of the Jews who applied in the bank. In June 1951, El Al landed in Baghdad and carried our family to Israel, among 120,000 who went to Israel during 1950 and 1951. We were stripped of all our properties by the Iraqi government and were allowed only one suitcase each and 50 dinars, British pounds, equivalent to about $150. We were considered traitors and would never be allowed to return. Following the '67 war with Israel, when only 3,000 Jews had remained in Iraq, the mistreatment and torture of Jews started again, with new false accusations. They were not allowed to work, their money in the bank was frozen, schools were closed, many of them were killed, many were hung as well, and many tried to flee through the Kurds in the north or through the south. Only the lucky ones succeeded in ending their journey safely. In the early 70s, the Jews were finally allowed to leave Iraq officially. Many of them went to Israel. Presently, there are only three Jews left in Iraq. Back to the people who arrived in Israel with El Al in 1950 and 1951, like myself, like Gladys Muallem. Israel was very poor. We arrived in a deserted area and lived in a tent in Ma'bara near Petah Tikva. We lived 6 months, a family of 7 people, without electricity, water, or facilities inside. Then we were moved to a wooden shack of 1 room. Also, no electricity, no facilities, nor running water. After 7 years, we got our shikun, a small apartment with all the facilities. Work was scarce. We had to work in anything to secure our living. My parents were desperate. I took the lead, spending long hours working in Tel Aviv and studying at night. I remember having to walk through dark alleys to get home, which I did with tears in my eyes. Life was so hard, and yet here I was not afraid to walk alone in the dark without worrying that someone would follow me. I could not have done that in Baghdad. At home, my 4 younger sisters never gave up. They studied with the help of kerosene lamps. Israel opened its arms to us. Nobody remained a refugee for long. We were fed and sheltered. We were given the opportunity to educate ourselves and gradually rebuild our lives. After 18 years in Israel, where my husband, Jamil Joseph Muallem, Zichrono Lebracha, contributed to 2 wars, we moved to Montreal, Canada. That also opened its arms to receive us. We had 2 children. And even though we were received warmly by the Iraqi Jewish community, we still had to meet other new challenges in a new country. We were thankful to Canada for giving us equal opportunities and for the peaceful, rewarding life and the high education that my children enjoyed at McGill University, with a master's and honors degrees by my son, Jeff Muallem, and pediatrics in medicine by my daughter, Ronit Muallem. We continue to enjoy the blessings of our beloved grandchildren. I always had Israel at heart where I visit very often. It makes me very happy to know that many of these refugees from Iraq occupy high positions in Israel now in politics, science, social positions, and mainly high tech. We are proud of our community and of Israel for helping us to be an important factor in that flourishing new country. We look forward to a continuing strong Israel with our hearts within and God overhead. Gladys Perez Muallem, Women's Learning Group Coordinator, Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, Montreal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisette. We will now hear from B'nai Brith Canada's Director of League for Human Rights, Mr. Marvin Rochon.
Bonsoir et merci à la congrégation Or Shalom pour l'invitation ce soir pour partager cet événement très, très spécial. I also like to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah. It's a propitious time to celebrate an important event, the resilience of Jews from Arab lands and from Iran. Tonight, we gather to give prominence to Jews from Arab lands and from Iran, Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. Jews are indigenous to Israel and the Middle East, but the story of the 900,000 Jews forced to flee in the mid-20th century from Arab nations to escape discrimination, hardship, and violence is unknown to most of the Canadian public. In November 2013, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs apprised the Canadian House of Commons that Jews from Arab lands were refugees and that their story needed to be told. Jews have lived in the Middle East and North Africa for 2,500 years. They're indigenous to the region. Despite legal barriers to their full participation in their majority Muslim societies, they contributed enormously to their host societies' well-being and economic success. The invasion of Israel in 1948 by numerous Arab nations was also accompanied by measures that violated international law, including pogroms, stripping of citizenship and civil rights, confiscation of individual and communal property. Expulsions occurred in waves: 1948-49, 1956, 1967 to 1969. But it went farther. In Iraq, there was brutal state terror to ensure that the population would be terrorized. In Baghdad, in January 1969, the Iraqi government carried out mass public hangings of Jews claiming that they were spies. The Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs studied the population of the Arab countries in Iran in 1948 and gave figures for the year that they tabled their report, 2013. In Algeria, in 1948, there had been a Jewish population of 140,000. In 2013, there were none, not one. In Egypt, there had been a Jewish population of 85,000 in 1948. The committee reported to Parliament that in 2013 there were only 100. In Iraq, there had been 135,000 Jews, with a history dating back 2,500 years. There were only 5. In Lebanon, there had been 5,000, and in 2013, only 50. In Morocco, a community of 265,000 shriveled to 3,000 in the year 2013. In Syria, there had been 30,000. Syria, a country that proclaimed its maturity, its democracy, its cosmopolitan nature to the world. There were only 50 Jews left in 2013. Tunisia, a community of 105,000, only 1,000. In Yemen, including Aden, 63,000 became 100. These refugees found shelter in Israel, but also in other countries, including Canada. They've never been compensated, not only for property estimated by the Foreign Affairs Standing Committee as in the many, many billions of dollars, or for their pain and suffering they endured. The experience of Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa needs to be recognized. Their narrative is largely missing from international discussions of what took place in the Middle East. They have made a life for themselves in countries such as France, the United States, Argentina, and of course Israel, where their descendants now make up more than 45% of the population. Despite the hardships that they face, they have contributed to every country where they have settled. Their sons and daughters, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren contribute to the arts, the sciences, to business, to politics, to medicine, to every field of endeavor in their host countries. Israel is stronger to have them. And every country in the Western world where Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews have settled has benefited enormously. We should tonight remember their plight, remember their hardship, but we should also appeal to everyone in Canada to learn their history, a history that shamefully is still too unknown. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde pour l'opportunité de vous adresser ce soir. Merci.
A member of the B'nai Brith Canada Sephardic and Mizrahi Committee, Sas Perez, also has quite a story to tell us. We invite Mr. Perez to share his journey of discovery and to also explain the internationally recognized Kaddish Initiative prayer. Sas.
So firstly, thank you to B'nai Brith for organizing this evening. It's been so instrumental for me, and I've learned a lot. This is a story that's a little different, and perhaps so fitting on this Festival of Lights. I hope to give you some light. The story of finding Jewish graves in an Arab land. So I'm going to turn to the story of 1947, when there was the first Miss Iraq pageant. Chosen as the queen of that pageant was a Jewess, Renee Dangour, a family member of mine. Next, I'm going to take you all the way down to 2017, when Miss Iraq and Miss Israel took a picture together at the Miss Universe pageant. Now, just a few months before November 2017, I got a message from my father. He'd been in a casino in London, and he met a member of Parliament of Iraq, Salim al-Jabouri, who said, "I want the Jews back in Iraq." Imagine, leader of Parliament. My father said to him, "Well, listen to me. My dad died in the early 50s, and the only reason I'll go to Baghdad is to get on a plane, get off the plane, go to his burial site, say my prayers, get back on that plane, and leave back to Montreal." So when in 2017 this picture appeared on Facebook, I wrote Salam Alaikum on the post to a friend of mine who's a Muslim living in the UK. No sooner than I had written that, next, I get a message on my messenger from a guy called Ahmed Laith from Iraq. And he says, I'm the manager of the Miss Iraq pageant, and I want to talk to your cousin, David Dangour. Now, David is the son of Renee Dangour, the former Miss Iraq. And I said, why? He said, I've lost all my sponsorships because of that picture. I said, because of one picture? And he said, yes, the Iraqi government has disowned me, the sponsors have left me, and I'm penniless. And I'd like David's help in order to start the pageant again. I asked David for his permission to pass on the information, and he said, sure, next. So what happens? I said, you know what? My dad told me about a story of him going to his father's grave in Baghdad. Would you help me find it? He said, sure. I said, would you know where it is? He said, yes. I said, where? He said, Sadr City. We know it for a different reason, don't we? So 48 hours later, he had hired a Hebrew translator from the university. He had made his way into the cemetery, and he found my paternal grandfather's grave. This was an incredible find because my father thought it had been lost. They had been moved in the early 60s by decree because they wanted to develop the land in Baghdad. Imagine, Jews buried for over 400 years suddenly had to move. So how to handle this? It was very difficult at the time. And I had it sent to my dad, who couldn't believe it, who had left it for gone, because he'd heard that it had been moved but had no news that it survived the move, as so many others did. Now, this picture that you see on the screen is actually a Shabbat. 4 candles were lit by this Muslim in Baghdad. My grandfather's children eventually had 13 grandchildren, but he had 4 children. How did they know? They had no idea. It just happened. So the story that I'm trying to tell you is one of hope. Next. Because if you see this picture with all the garbage strewn throughout the cemetery, hope came through a simple verbiage of peace. Salam alaikum in Arabic. Peace be upon you. Shalom aleichem. They took it upon themselves, with a little bit of help from me from afar, you can imagine what that was, to clean up the cemetery. And I told them, we can't stop at just one stone. I want a picture of every single one there. And they started, and they worked, and they got 150 of them, until somebody from the government said, stop. Now remember, we've heard tonight a lot of stories about one-way tickets, one-way passports. Well, this is a story of hope that one day all of the burial sites of Jews around the world will be safe and will be allowed to go back and say our prayers. And I know people in this audience that have found in an album that I saved online some of their own family through this initiative. Next. So we started a Kaddish. I said, we can't leave this just as it is. And in the first year, which was November 2018, we had 12 shuls and a church. Next. The church was run by Father John Walsh, a great local friend of the Jewish community that I met through the Tel Aviv University Friends in Canada, and a man who wrote this prayer that you can see online in commemoration of Jews buried in Arab lands. This is now November 2018, 12 shuls and a church. Next. Now we're in 2019, and I get another message on Facebook, this time from a Lebanese. And I said, can you find my family in Lebanon's burial sites? And he said, yes, I can. And what you see is the name of my great-grandfather on my mother's side. Next. And this is his tombstone. So think about this story of hope, and we're in the Festival of Lights that lasted all those nights that it wasn't supposed to, and these things are just happening by happenstance. So in 2019, we pushed again, and we got 50 shuls in a church, and we got the Jerusalem Post to write about it. And suddenly people were starting to pick up on this until in 2020, unfortunately due to COVID, we couldn't have any live events, but fortunately due to COVID, we went worldwide. We posted a prayer and 15,000 downloads, and virtual events around the world occurred to remember Jews buried in Arab lands. Next. We all mourn in our own ways. We all remember in our own ways. And this is a painting that my cousin did of our grandfather in commemoration of him. This is a Facebook page that you can visit to see grave sites in various Arab countries as they are. One is actually a new real estate development. There is no evidence left of the site. Next. So we created a Kaddish for Jews every year to commemorate around this time. And finally, I want to share with you what this means to me personally. Go ahead. These are the sites that you can look up all this information. And this is a picture of my paternal grandfather. They had 13 grandchildren eventually. There was only one named Sasson Moshe Paris, and that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sas. We will end this evening with the Kaddish Initiative Prayer for Jews from Arab countries and Iran. It will be sung by our very own Chazan from Or Shalom, Synagogue. Nous terminons la soirée par la lecture et le chant de la prière spéciale pour le Kaddish Initiative, qui sera chantée par notre cantor, Or Shalom.
אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, כתוב בדברי יחזקאל נביאך, ואתה בן אדם הענח בשברון מותניים, ובמרירות תאנח לעיניהם, והיה כי יאמרו אליך, על מה אתה נאנח, ואמרת אל שמועה, כי באה ונמס כל לב, ורפו כל ידיים, וחד כל רוח, וכל ברכיים תלכנה מים, הנה באה ונהיית נאום אדוני אלוהים. ובעוונותינו עשה אדוני אשר זמם, ביצע אמרתו אשר ציווה, וראינו בדאבון ליבנו הריגת אחינו ואחיותינו, ושרפת בתי כנסיות וספרי תורה בידי שכנינו הערבים, ששכנו לדורות בקרבתם. יתומים היינו ואין אב, אמותינו כאלמנות. אתה אדוני לעולם תשב, כסאך לדור ודור. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם. אל מלא רחמים שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים, את נשמות אחינו ואחיותינו, שנהרגו ושנרצחו על ידי אכזרים ואויבים בארצות ההגרים. נהפכו ארצות מגוריהם לכבשני אש ואנשי שלומם לעריצים. יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו, בעל הרחמים, שתסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותם, ויקיים בנו מקרא שכתוב, ובא לציון גואל. מי ייתן מציון ישועת ישראל, יגל יעקב ישמח ישראל, בשוב אדוני שבות עמו, וכן יהי רצון, ונאמר אמן. Thank you all for joining. Merci à tous de nous avoir rejoints.